Ealdred could hardly help but be aware of how Ige, his companion, lover, and devoted attendant, had frequent difficulties with foreigners. They brought the combative and pugnacious traits of her character to the fore. The Bengali word for all non-Mengis was Gazbutir, meaning those who cannot speak properly. Notwithstanding his own foreignness to her, for she made him an exception, she tended to view all Gazbutir as wilfully confusing and contrary-minded. For Ige it was only the Mengis, who had once been the great imperial power of the immeasurable steppes, that lived in a civilized manner. Those who lived differently were at best mistaken, and at worst wilfully insulting. This tendency to consider the Gazbutir to be people who were guilty of being unnecessarily awkward on purpose, just to irritate her, was a characteristic of her truculent personality that he foresaw might be a particular problem in the queendoms. Ige's culture was not one to tolerate women lording it over men. Whilst her habit of pouring the filthiest verbal abuse at most of the men she met was archly typical of Mengis women, this was not in any way a challenge to the male supremacism of the Mengis lifestyle. Rather, the barbed tongues of Mengis womenfolk were intended to prompt and provoke highly masculine responses from their men to the mutual satisfaction of both sexes. Mengis girls used outrageously obscene swearing as a way to incite their men to prove their masculinity. Ige was never abusive to Ealdred because she had no doubts about him, especially when he was lashing her with a whip during sex. In her eyes, Ealdred was all that a man should be, and her conduct toward him was therefore extremely respectful. Ige's frequent taunts and slurs were invariably directed at men whom she felt had failed in their duty to be properly manly, or who had encroached upon her prickly dignity. This had happened quite a lot during their sojourn south through Picardy, and twice it had been unavoidable to settle the matter with iron. Once Ealdred had found it necessary to put his spear in the belly of a very pretty teenage leader of a gang of similarly dandified youths, whom Ige had affronted by making hand gestures of eunuch castration toward them, which unfortunately their leader had understood only too well. The second incident involved Ige skewering with her much-prized dagger a pompous peacock of a Picardian who had sought to slap her face after she called him, in Bengali, a cunt-licking poltroon of a widow's dildo, and he had comprehended her tone of voice, if not the actual words. What Ige would make of the subservient Gathkari men was all too predictable, and Ealdred had tried to prepare her for this uncomfortable experience by explaining that Gathkaris were under a kind of political spell in which the men had lost their manhood and lived by the matriarchal beliefs and values of their mystic religion. This level of communication between the Anglian and his Oriental companion was now possible, happily, for since their meeting with the merchant in Pistoia, who had acted as translator for them, now deceased by Ige's hand, she had begun to learn English from him, so as to be able to communicate with her Effendi in his own language. But while she had gathered a command of a useful vocabulary of over 200 words, she had made less progress in her comprehension of why the stupid Gazbutir behaved the way they did. When Ealdred had essayed the information that Gathkari women rule men, Gathkari men serve women, Ige had replied,
Effendi, why Gathkari men not kill women?
The astuteness of this response had stumped the veteran soldier for the moment, as it was such an excellent question, very much to the point, and one for which he did not quite have an adequate answer. Even so, he tried. Gathkari men worship woman god, so serve women because they think women better than men, like God better than men. But Ige, not to be put off, had replied with her shrewd, no-nonsense Mengis reasoning,
Effendi, why Gathkari men not kill women and worship man-god?
In the end, she had more or less convinced him of the unassailable logic of her position, and he had brought the discussion to a close by advising, "Gathkari men mad. We keep away from." On this, he found his sagacious bed-warmer in full agreement. Ealdred had visited the queendoms once before in his life, as a mercenary for the Okrani prophet Vizier in his war against the southern Gathkaris. There had been no profit in it for the Anglian, because the Okrani had poisoned the Gathkar army's water supply, forcing a surrender from their priestess queen, who had not wished to oppose the invader even before her soldiers were decimated by poison. At that time, more than a decade ago, incessant societal convulsions had convinced Ealdred that Gathkar was a place barely able to hold itself together as a state due to its seemingly fatal internal contradictions. It had provided him with a good deal of comical bemusement, but it was an entertaining perplexity that was exceeded by his sheer astonishment that such a society had ever come into existence in the first place. He had found it safe to travel through the queendoms, despite his evident maleness, because his privileged social status as a non-Gathkari, or honoured guest, as the Matriarchy had instructed all foreigners should be called, took precedence over his political and cultural inferiority as a male. On his previous visit, short though it was, he had learned something of the history of this bewilderingly perverse place. Long ago, the original Gathkaris had been descendants of a wave of landless Gelton, who had migrated eastward across the narrow strip of sea that extended inland and was known to the Gelton as La Fosse, or the Ditch. Occupying the largely empty territory on the other side of the ditch, they established themselves and built a nation-state where none had stood before. This was when the famous twin cities of Bool in Bourbon and Fari in Gathkar were erected in all their majesty to face each other across La Fosse as a testament to those who had constructed such architectural marvels.